Good morning and welcome to the School for Advanced Research webinar series, Book Discussions. My name is Paul Ryer. I'm the Director of Scholar Programs here at SAR, and it is my great pleasure and privilege to welcome you to today's event. Today's event is a discussion of a newly published book, Back East: How Westerners Invented a Region. The book is by Flannery Burke, PhD. Flannery is an associate professor of American Studies at St. Louis University. She has a PhD in history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, also a master's degree, and her Bachelor of Arts in history was from Bryn Mawr College. I can't cover Flannery's full CV, but she has two books before this one titled A Land Apart: The Southwest and the Nation in the 20th Century, University of Arizona Press, 2017, and From Greenwich Village to Taos: Primitivism and Place at Mabel Dodge Lujan's, University Press of Kansas, 2008. She will be joined in conversation by Deborah Jackson Taffa, a Native American writer who is a member of the Quechan and Laguna Pueblo tribes, best known for her 2024 memoir, Whiskey Tender, which was a finalist for the 2024 National Book Award for nonfiction. She holds an MFA from the University of Iowa and is the director of the MFA Creative Writing Program at the Institute of American Indian Arts here in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So please welcome Flannery and Deborah. With that, I'm going to step out. I'll come back to help with the Q&A at the end. I'll be listening in, and please take it away.
Thank you, Paul. I'm honored to be in conversation with you today, Dr. Burke. I love the questions of region, identity, and narrative in Back East. Rather than attempt a synopsis, I thought perhaps we could begin with the voice of the project by having you read a short excerpt.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm going to read a little bit from the preface, which is from here in Santa Fe, New Mexico. "We should get a stoop," announced my brother at dinner when he was 12 or 13. We lived 15 miles from the city center of Santa Fe, New Mexico, in a one-story ranch-style house on 2.5 acres off of a dirt road that a neighbor periodically graded himself because it fell within a no man's land of county jurisdiction. We had no basement, no gradient to the yard. I imagined a set of stone steps in the middle of the driveway, a drop from the edge to the gravel below. At 19, I knew a lot, and I knew that we did not need a stoop. "What would we possibly do with a stoop?" I asked. "Sit on it," insisted my brother. "Shoot the breeze with people passing by." I smiled at the Western expression, looked out the window at the sunset. A banner Halloween constituted as many as 2 trick-or-treaters. "Where did you learn about stoops?" asked my father. He didn't like city crowds, but he did approve of Sesame Street. It's possible that he was agnostic on stoops. "Stoop Dude," answered my brother. "He's on a show. He wants to win a comics contest, and he calls himself Stoop Dude, who is one of his comic characters." "He must be from New York," asserted my mother. She was fond of New York, although I think she only visited twice. She read The New Yorker, even the lists of art show openings and film premieres that she could not attend. "Maybe," said my brother, "somewhere back east." My brother was trying to include me. I attended college outside Philadelphia. A stack of 17 magazines under my bed paid tribute to the East that I thought that I would discover upon arriving in Philadelphia's suburbs. For more knowledgeable readers, the maple leaf-strewn paths and plaid skirts advertised in the magazine's pages every September connoted New England. New England was back east too. In fact, a lot of places were back east. If my family met tourists visiting Santa Fe from Indiana, we said that they were from back east. Some people got jobs back east in Chicago. A lot of people I knew had gone to school back east in Vermont and Ohio and Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and Virginia. For years, I thought that I was simply ignorant. How was I to know there were different parts of the East, or that Pennsylvanians thought Ohio was the Midwest, or that the East Coast of Virginia was in the South? By the time I was 19, I had visited New York with a family friend, and my brother and I had accompanied my dad to conferences in Washington, D.C. But there was still a lot back east that intimidated me. Toll roads and subway systems, the fast-paced accents that I had only heard in the movies and on television, the Ivy League schools, the halls of Congress, the New England summer camps that so many of my college classmates seemed to have attended. Even the snow was different, icier and less powdery than that of western slopes. As I started college, I realized that if the East was a place I was to understand, I would need to study. And then I talk about my studies a little bit, and I conclude the preface with, so many people had imagined a place that they called out west, that their imagination had a history. I wanted to know, where was the history of Westerners' imagination? If I told it, could I escape the frontier? If Westerners were the subjects instead of the objects of the story, might the ending change? Was back east a region? Was it a region that mattered? This book is my best effort to build my brother's stoop. Stop by, shoot the breeze.
So lovely. I really liked it. Well, I love the opening. While we shared a New Mexico upbringing and a love of Sesame Street as kids, apparently, my mother did not read the list of art openings and film premieres in New York City. So it was just a wonderful portrait of a family that contextualizes the project. And as someone whose culture has often been wrongly invented by the collective imagination, I really loved your book's driving inquiry. And I was impressed, though not surprised, by the broad themes in Back East, very broad. I mean, you explore the effect of regional thinking on conservation efforts, farming economies, literary organizations, writing conferences, educational booklets, dude ranches, Native and Mexican perspectives, etc., etc. You explore so much, and yet you've decided to do so through the lens of author biographies. Why this lens? Why did you decide to focus on authors specifically?
Two reasons. First, because I come from American Studies, I originally thought it was going to be multimedia. I would talk about film, I would talk about television, I would talk about art, I'd talk about folklore. I was going to do it all. And it was way too much. And as you just narrated, there's a lot in the book as it is. And it was going to be way, way, way too big if I was doing so many different means of expression in the same book with this concept. So that was the first reason. The second reason is that I started finding connections among authors via texts. So Horace Caton, who was an African American from Seattle and moved to Chicago to become a sociologist, I found in his archive copies of The Debunker, which was a socialist publication created in Girard, Kansas, southeastern Kansas, in the early 20th century, that I talk about in a very earlier part of the book before I talk about Horace Caton, because that same publisher, in addition to publishing The Debunker, published these little books called the Little Blue Books that were a source of, kind of an every man and every woman's education in the 1930s. And so I thought, wow, it's like someone left behind a little blue book on the train, and Horace Caton picked it up 20 years later, and he's, carrying the ideas forward. So books and texts and institutions that support books and texts, like the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities, I just started seeing all of these connections among people who are kind of on my list to investigate.
It's a wonderful structural kind of framework to have adopted, I think. I admire this book so much for the way it chronicles historiographical silence, epistemic injustice, and the erasure of non-whites and women out west via the imagination of both Easterners and settler colonialists of the West, to reveal sort of the powerful effect that regional myths have on identity. Can you speak to the interplay between East and West narratives in your book? How do our ideas of one another create tension, both good and bad, in your view?
So there's 2 or 3 different trajectories, I think. There's one, which I talk about in the first part of the book, which is a kind of Midwestern frontier settler colonialism. So Midwesterners still, to this day, will say back east, and they mean New York and Boston and Washington, D.C. But they're kind of resentful that they've become the flyover country. And Chicagoans can sometimes be, yeah, not resentful because Chicagoans are so confident in themselves, but, a little resentful that they're the second city and not New York, the first city. So there's this first back and forth where the frontier, in the narrative of the frontier, I don't believe in the frontier, but in the story of the frontier, the frontier passes the Midwest by. So it's no longer like the cool place of opportunity and progress, but they still have back east. So they get kind of, they sort of like drop out of this back east, out west dynamic. And sometimes Midwestern writers are frustrated by that.
Excellent. Yeah.
Yeah. So then there's a second version, and that is Westerners clap back. And that is people out west who feel like Easterners are condescending, feel like they control the money, feel like they control the government policy, and that Western perspectives are never listened to. And so they very strongly, people like Wallace Stegner, people like Bernard DeVoto, they very strongly assert a Western identity whenever they're engaged in Western conservation advocacy. And a big part of their Western identity is portraying back east as a place that does not get them. And then there's a third version, which is, yeah, back east is there, and those Ivy League schools matter, and Washington, D.C. matters, but that's not the whole of our experience in this place that is frequently called the West, but that we might call something else. So we might call it Laguna Pueblo, or, we might call it Aztlan, or we might call it Texas. We might have a very different definition of where we are. People from back east might call it out west. And so for those folks, there's a sort of a subtle kind of from the side ongoing correction that out west is not the entirety of what this region, this place is.
You've done a very good job of kind of highlighting the three sections of the book with that answer, which readers will see when they engage with it. Yeah, there are so many rich characters with interesting biographies in this book. I mean, you include Leslie Marmon Sokol and Louise Erdrich from my world. And then there's, like you said, Wallace Stegner and Udall and Devoto. And there was one that I really enjoyed reading about, though. There were several. But the first is Arabelle Thompson, who I initially, because of the way it was written, I initially assumed she was white. And then at a certain moment, I realized, no, she's not. She's Black. And I was so moved when you quoted her as saying, after she had placed a white job seeker in her job and in her role of helping people find jobs, quote, "I know there is still good in the world, that way down underneath most Americans are fair, that my people and your people can work together and live together in peace and happiness." I just thought she was such a worthwhile person to explore. Can you contextualize her a bit, her experience, her life experience, and how she fits in the book for our listeners?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm not at all surprised that you liked her, because I think just about everyone who encounters Arabelle Thompson loves her. So she grew up on the North Dakota prairies, and her mother died when she was young. She had four older brothers. She was very, very close with her father. And her brothers all left for places like Chicago, places like the Twin Cities for work. And her father farmed for a while. He worked for the Nonpartisan League in North Dakota, which was kind of a left-leaning agrarian farmers organization. And he worked for them for a while. And then he ran a secondhand store for a while, and he was also a chef, and would travel and serve food all across the state and the region. And when he died, she was kind of cast adrift, and she was in college and got a sponsor to finish college in Iowa. And then she went to Chicago. And she worked for Ebony magazine at Chicago. I believe she was the longest employee at Ebony magazine. So she both wrote for Ebony and she edited at Ebony. And I think she worked there longer than anyone else, which is quite something, for a Black woman journalist in the 1940s. And that's just really extraordinary. She had this job with the WPA in job placement and was able to save some money from that and traveled pretty extensively in the United States. And it was when she had returned from those travels and was describing placing this white job seeker that she had the experience that you just read and described. She wrote a memoir called American Daughter with support from the Newberry Library in Chicago, and that's what that quote is from. And that memoir really helped launch her. So she wrote that memoir. She was then a fellow at the Breadloaf Writers Conference, which is one of these institutions where people I study kind of keep running into one another. And she wrote for Ebony magazine. And she was extraordinarily adept at writing for mixed race audiences, just a champion code switcher. And I'm sure Black readers can find instances of code switching in American Daughter that I, as a white reader, cannot. But I think it's just amazing how deft she was. And I think that was partly a product of growing up often the only Black girl in a white North Dakota. She didn't perceive it as a purely white North Dakota. North Dakotans themselves in those years were very proud of, their various European heritages. And so she had Jewish friends, she had Norwegian friends, she had German friends, and she understood them from those backgrounds. But she also very much understood the racial politics of the United States, and she knew when she was addressing white readers and when she was addressing Black readers and when she was addressing both.
Mm-hmm. Very good. We both have ties to St. Louis, which was such a powerful American city until it wasn't. St. Louis lost its power. Chicago gained powers. Cities rise and fall. But the East Coast in the American, like the East Coast, it could never. It's like, and I think, I know that we all know that has to do with our origin story, and that East Coasters themselves probably have some cultural cringe in relation to Europe. I mean, like LCD Sound System summarized it well in their song North American Scum. One of the things that I admired about the book was the way you were very intellectually vulnerable in sort of not only recognizing the East Coast as a force that felt oppressive in your life as a child, but the way different people at different parts of the country kind of have always felt this sort of cringe in the Midwest and the West in relation to the East Coast. And I'm wondering if writing the book liberated you in some ways of some of your older views about the East Coast and changed the way you think about the country, and how so?
I think it did, yeah, because I was steeped in this education about all of the errors of the imagined West. So the way that people in the East had imagined the Western United States is wrong in all sorts of ways. So I was primed to find the errors. And yes, I had a stereotype about the East Coast as being condescending. So did Arabelle Thompson. After she visited New York, she said New Yorkers, contrary to Western propaganda, turned out to be very friendly people.
Shocking.
Yes. So I became aware of my own prejudices. I find myself still falling into them once in a while. My child goes to school back east. When he was looking at colleges, I was like, well, how about University of New Mexico? Like, how about places in California? Like, as a Westerner, I kind of wanted him to go west. And my husband at one point said, I think I'd be happier if he went back east. And I was a little hurt, and yet he has landed so well. He knew my son knew exactly what he needed for himself in terms of a college, and it really had very little to do with region.
Yeah, you really highlight all of this sort of tension very well when you talk about the commonalities and differences between Stegner and Devoto. together they manufacture this idea of the white educated outdoorsman. And perhaps for conservation purposes, that drive, they perform. I think of them as having performed this identity. And it reminded me of like the Dude Ranchers performance and my ancestors, the Buffalo Bill Wild West show performers, also in their performativity. The West almost seems like it lends itself to performance. But you do note that Stegner and Devoto differed in their performative attitudes about the East, in that Devoto wanted to belong to it, you say, I'm quoting, and Stegner wanted to best it, which I thought was so cleverly observed. I wonder if you could contextualize the writers in the third section of the book, in their more pragmatic use of it, or their indifference to it, or their ability to create confidence without it, how they differed exactly from wanting to best it or wanting to belong to it.
Yeah, so I start the third section with a poet named Ricardo Sanchez, who was an activist. And like a lot of activists, he could get under people's skin. And like a lot of activists, he was charming and charismatic and compelling. And both things happened to me as I learned more about him and read his work. So sometimes I was really annoyed. Sometimes I was absolutely captivated. Sometimes I was all riled up. I was like, "Viva la raza!" Like so. He's a compelling writer. I think if someone can read his work 50 years later and be transported that way. He grew up in El Paso, Texas, and played a big role, I think, in the literary community in Texas, and for a while served on an advisory board for the National Endowment for the Arts in poetry. And it's not that he didn't care about the East. And he was working with Latino activists on the East Coast, Puerto Rican activists, and learning from Black Puerto Ricans, kind of how to think through questions of race and racial difference within Chicano, he would have said Chicano communities. And at the same time, he was remembering his grandfather's background as a migrant shepherd. His grandfather would sometimes go to Utah as a shepherd from New Mexico. And he was chronicling his own travels. He went to Milwaukee, where he started the Canto al Pueblo Poetry Festival, the Midwestern Poetry Festival, Canto al Pueblo. And he also knew migrant laborers who were going northward to Colorado, northward to Wisconsin, to Minnesota, to Michigan. And so he was thinking north-south often. Not because he or his parents were immediate immigrants from Mexico, but because his own life journey and his family's life journeys had been along this north-south axis. So he knew about folks back east, and a fellowship back east played a big role for him. He gave poetry readings back east. It's not that he didn't recognize the prestige of a poetry reading at Yale, but that was not the only thing that was on his mind when he was thinking about origins and region.
I love that you point to value systems here, really, and in the epilogue as well. Go on.
Okay. I can stop too, Deborah, if you want
No, go ahead.
direction. Yeah. So I'm gonna skip the next chapter and go to the ending chapter. So in the ending chapter, I include an interview with you, and I include an interview with my second cousins, the Gassans.
Yes.
And I did that because I had this vague memory that my cousin David Gassan had been recruited to go to Dartmouth. And he wound up deciding that he didn't want to go. And he decided that for a few reasons. It was really remote. He had never really heard of it. There was pressure in his family from his dad and his mom. His dad really wanted him to go. His mom is a quite famous artist nationally and internationally.
Yes.
And David wanted to follow in her footsteps, and that would have been more easily achieved here in New Mexico than it would have been by going to Dartmouth. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, he was also being trained by his aunt and his grandmother to assume religious responsibilities at Pickery's Pueblo. Yeah. And for all these reasons, he chose not to go. And one of the sections of the interview, which is deposited at the IAIA library, One of the sections of the interview, he says he had an internship with the Department of the Interior. And he said, it's good that I had that experience because that taught me what I didn't want. And it taught me who I was. And he says, I'm an artist and I'm a really good artist. And this is who I was and this is who I was meant to be. So again, it's not that the East doesn't matter. It matters a lot. He learned a lot at working at the Department of the Interior. He would have learned a lot going to Dartmouth. But that wasn't what was most important to him for his education. That's not what he needed for his education when he went to college.
I loved the privileging of his value system and the kind of knowing who he was and what he needed at the same time. It was a very profound movement into that third chapter. I really appreciated it. And I'm thinking here of Robin Wall Kimmerer's claim that the word it is the most dangerous word in the English language for the way that it robs the earth and our animal brethren of their agency. And I'm thinking about how the land, for me, especially out here in the West, has its own biography. I never liked the New Critics and the idea that work could be divorced from its maker's biography. And I want to note the land's biography here in relation to the West, especially in the way that you write about it as being this imagined good place. And you kind of critique that notion. So I guess I'm seeing a similarity between the way early US writers far from the libraries of Europe invented an American aesthetic and this invention of the West as a good place. And is it something that you intended to critique and complicate when you started the book? Or was it a discovery that you made as you wrote? I mean, I'm thinking of the Japanese internment camps that you write about and the way that you complicate the West as some sort of a fantasy playground for Easterners.
Right, right. I included incarceration camps for Japanese Americans for a couple reasons. And I think I will get to an answer to your question. Number one, I wanted a diverse cast of writers. I know Western writers are a diverse cast of people. And so I didn't want everybody, it couldn't all be Stegner and Devoto and Udall. There are other Westerners and they perceive of themselves as Westerners. And so I wanted that in there. I also read this really, really great book in the course of my research that's kind of outdated now. And I mean, it's the research is not outdated. People don't read it anymore, and they should totally keep reading it. It's by a great scholar at the University of British Columbia named Henry Yu, and it's called Thinking Orientals. And it's about Asian Americans who participated in the Chicago School of Sociology. And that was recommended to me by a historian named John Finley, and I read it very early in my research. And I realized that, number one, for some Asian Americans from the West Coast, Chicago was back east. And number two, not all people moved eastward willingly. So this is fairly unknown in the, I think a fair number of high schools have gotten to the point where they teach about Japanese American incarceration during World War II. What people don't know is that there was this other program called a resettlement program where Japanese Americans could leave the camps, often for education, if they would not resettle on the West Coast. So they could not return to the West Coast. It was still a forced migration, but they could leave the camps. And the city that had the largest number of Japanese Americans who left via this resettlement program, what was called this resettlement program, was Chicago. So there was this intersection of these Japanese Americans who had participated in the Chicago School of Sociology and Japanese Americans who were coming from the camps. And as a result of that, there is ethnographic research about that experience. And it's really dicey because these Chicago school trained sociologists were informing basically on their own people as a result of this program. So using that research is really, really delicate work. But I thought it was very important to the overall story for readers to understand that not everybody was moving willingly in these years.
Mhm. Yeah, I love the undoing and this kind of subversion of some of the dominant mainstream narratives that we have. And that's an example of you breaking one down. Yeah. So, did you know that you were going to critique it, or as you researched, you began to see ways in which the story was opening up for you? I often think of discovery as being one of the prime motivations of making it through a book, right? How
Mhm.
surprised were you by some of the things that you found out about?
I'm trained in the history of the American West,
So
so
you're,
I know the bright stories and I know the dark stories, and I know
mhm.
the stories in between. So I'd say a lot of the dark stories were not surprising to me. I've encountered them before. But in light of out west, back east, and how people navigate the narrative imperatives of
Mhm.
those two phrases, I feel like I did learn some things. And I knew very, very little about this resettlement program.
Mhm.
So I definitely learned about that. And it, again, Henry Yu's Thinking Orientals, it's just extraordinary. Like
I
it's,
wrote down the title. Mhm.
yeah,
I'll
yeah.
look it
So
up.
that was revelatory. I learned a lot there.
I do want to get to questions. I do want to get to audience questions, but I have a couple more quick ones. I don't want to leave the current political state that we're in completely untouched. Kind of thinking about that and drafting my questions for you today, I was thinking about Mikhail Lermontov, who made famous the Russia's southern frontier in his novel A Hero of Our Time. And in that book, he immortalized this 19th century expansion into the Caucasus Mountains. And they're the only other superpower I know of that have a concept of an edge where civilization meets the uncivilized in a way that's analogous to the American Wild West. And some notions of conquest and romantic fascination with this frontier. Do you think that your book is an undoing of power in a way maybe larger than we've discussed? And I know that's kind of a hard question. You can pass on it if not, but I didn't want to, there's so much that we think about as authors when we get through a book. And I didn't want to leave that opportunity untouched to talk about how this notion of imperialistic expansion into a different, and how much has that shaped the American psyche, and how much does it play into what we see happening today?
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to claim big things for the book
Mhm.
that it hasn't achieved yet. I will express that much confidence. But
I think that it made my wheels turn, though, or I would not have emerged with that sort of comparison. Mm.
yeah. Your question makes me think of the chapter that I skipped over in the third part, and that chapter is about a white supremacist weekly newspaper called the Primrose and Cattleman's Gazette. And I argue that the editor of that paper, who is also writing for that paper, um, cynically used the iconography of a pioneer frontier of settler colonialism to cover over what he was really doing, which
Mhm.
was engaging in fraud with quite desperate farmers on the Great Plains during the farm crisis of the 1970s and the early 1980s. And this was one of those like great moments where the text provided an intersection that I didn't think I would find, but boy, was it great when I did.
Mhm.
So I always wanted Calvin Trillin to be in the book because my dad grew up in northeastern Kansas and Calvin Trillin grew up in Kansas City. And my dad just thought that Calvin Trillin was like the best thing ever. I mean, he had gone to Yale and he was so funny and he wrote for the New Yorker. And so when I heard about Back East, I also heard a lot about Calvin Trillin. So
Mhm.
I wanted Calvin Trillin to be in the book, and I thought that there had to be something about the way Western iconography has been used by white supremacists in the United
Mhm.
States. So I felt like that had, and the way Back East iconography had been used. by white supremacists. So I knew there had to be something. And Calvin Trillin wrote this amazing article about the Primrose and Cattleman's Gazette and the bigger movement that they were writing for in the New Yorker. And I was like, bingo, there's my intersection. So I do think like reading that chapter, reading the Devoto chapter about the effort to eliminate, basically to make the Bureau of Land Management a stillborn organization. The research for both of those chapters did resonate a lot with the present moment politically
Yes.
to me.
Yeah. What do you hope your readers, this is my last question, what do you hope your readers take away from Back East?
The final line of the book is begin anywhere. And I say you don't have to start out west. You don't have to start back east. You don't have to start down south. You don't have to start up north. You don't have to start, from beyond the pale. You can begin anywhere. Just read. Definitely read. And as you're reading, think about how your origins are influencing what you're taking from what you're reading.
That's so lovely. Thank you so much. And with that, Flannery, I would love to open up to questions. Perhaps we can have our host come back to help that process. Thank you, Paul.
Hello. Oh, I've been following along with huge interest and thousands of questions, a lot of which have already been covered. I do see, before we continue our conversation, I see that we don't have any Q&A, which is unusual. Folks, I see a lot of people following. Please, there we go. There's the first one. Yeah, so it's coming. I have a question, just in a general question. The West as a category, or any of the categories of space and place, it's a bit of a shifter, right? It will shift. You've talked about this actually. And yet and one could get into kind of, I think, a not very productive battle about where the boundaries of category like that is. And I don't think that's that productive because I think, well, for one thing, the West, as opposed to, say, Russia, the West, it could be really shifted in loads of ways. And does it include the Pacific Rim or not? And so, and then you talked about the North-South tensions. But I thought what was interesting about what you were talking about, Flannery, was the way it's instead of it being sort of lateral question, it's also root. It's a question of being rooted, and that I thought was where there's some power to talk about the rootedness of rather than of vertical, if you will, rather than horizontal. I don't know. It's just a thought, and I don't know to what extent that helped you from getting bogged down in those kind of border boundary policing kinds of things.
Those border boundary policing kind of things were all the rage in the 1990s when I went to graduate school to study the history of the American West.
Yeah.
So that's when the new Western historians galloped onto the scene. Patty Limerick, Richard White, Donald Worster. Sometimes my own advisor, Bill Cronin, was grouped in with those as the Gang of Four, they were called by some of their detractors. There was an article, I think, in the New York Times Magazine about the new Western historians. And what the new Western historians were saying is that the West is a place and not a process. And some of the debates that emerged after that were, okay, if it's a place, how do you draw lines around the place? Where does the place begin and end? And that then led to conversations about, well, it's a place and it's a process at the same time. Which I think is what, we all taught our students maybe in the early aughts. And then I think Western historians got a little more clued in to what was going on in Native American and Indigenous studies. And some really great scholars learned from scholars, really great US scholars learned from scholars in Australia about the scholarship of settler colonialism. And then people started saying, it kind of doesn't matter where you draw the box.
Right.
What matters is how deeply are you thinking about the place? But people in the place think of themselves as Midwesterners, Westerners, Easterners, Texans, Tejanos, Californios. They do have a regional identity. And by virtue of the expressions of their regional identity, they affect real world things. And one of the things I argue in the book is that Bernard DeVoto and Wallace Stegner's enthusiasm for the natural world and the Western literary culture's enthusiasm for the natural world influenced the creation of the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities, because Stuart Udall and his wife Lee Udall, really hustled to bring an environmental humanism into the halls of Washington, D.C. So it's not that. Yes, it is invented, one's regional identity, but that doesn't mean it doesn't matter and doesn't have material impact.
Right. Indigenous people as well choose the trajectory that they want to build a history on often differently than that sort of manifest destiny story that we were all taught in school. And you address that in the book as well, that it's also directional. I mean, for many of us, we think a lot about North America and South America as being this indigenous stronghold with a lot of cultural interactions that happened prior to the United States becoming the United States. And I appreciated very much that you tried to change the narrative access in sections of the book. I think we do have a question. Would you like to read it, Paul?
Sure. Yeah. This is an anonymous question. Critiques of Said often refer to Occidentalism as a counterforce to his category of Orientalism. Do you see something similar going on in the US with the East imagining the West and the West imagining the East? But maybe your closing statement already answered my question.
I do see something similar. Yes. And I mean, there's all sorts of kinds of scholarship in this realm. My colleague Ben Looker, as we were preparing for a conversation about Back East, reminded me that Lewis Mumford wrote about people who had migrated to the suburbs in the post-World War II era, invented this ethnic neighborhood history for themselves, where everyone had been a tenement worker, everyone had been a tenement dweller, and everyone had been a sweatshop laborer. And that just wasn't, and ethnic neighborhoods were always, tight-knit. And that's what had been lost by the journey to the suburbs. And sometimes that was true. And sometimes people going to the suburbs had ancestors who had engaged in that kind of work and those kinds of living environments, but not everyone. So yeah, the capacity of what we imagine to influence what we do. And Said talks about that in Orientalism. People practicing Occidentalism would be doing the same. They are having material impact when they engage in these fictions, even though they're fictions.
We have another question from Linda Hull. If you were to start anywhere, such as New Mexico, how would you start and where do you think your research would lead?
So I'm pondering this next project. Watchers may have noticed I have a tendency to bring my family in. I'm pondering this next project that a friend of mine told me was too cheesy a title, but I haven't come up with a better one. I'm calling it Hercules Jr. and the Lost Territory. And it's about my grandfather's uncles, Herculano and Edmundo Baca, who both fought in World War I. And Edmundo was killed in the war and is buried at Arlington Cemetery as Edmund. Herculano was killed in an industrial accident in the early 1920s, not that long after the war, and is buried in Shoemaker, New Mexico as Herculano. And so in terms of like histories of whitening, I feel, poor Herculano, it's harder to go from Herculano to Hercules than it is from Edmundo to Edmund. So I want to write about the two of them, going to Europe, fighting in World War I. And then the lost territory refers to the lost territory that Mexican Americans lost in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the lost territory that Native peoples in northern New Mexico lost as a result of Spanish settler colonialism, which does not go east to west, the lost ground that led to Edmundo's death, And then my own family's lost connection to the place where Herculano and Edmundo grew up. So it's not really a back east or an out west kind of story, but it does begin in the area around Watrous, New Mexico.
Mm-hmm. We have a question that is about the South and kind of the erasure of the South. The
Yes.
idea that it's not the East. What is it? It's like flyover country in many ways. And this person who's asking says that she lived for some time in North Carolina before moving back to Santa Fe, and what that experience was like in terms of feeling almost like she was living abroad. And she's wondering as she unwinds that experience, if in your research you encountered or how you thought about that absence, the absence of the South in the national East-West narrative.
So the West also winds up being absent in North-South narratives. You know, the West only comes into play when you get to the Kansas-Nebraska crisis. When westward expansion, you know, tests the boundaries of slavery. But what I'd like to answer this question with is that I actually think the South is present. And I'd like to tell this story that one of my students at School for Advanced Research told this summer, because I taught a summer class at SAR about Back East. And I asked all of my students on the last day to bring in Back East examples. And one of my students is from Texas, and he described this trip that his family took when he was young to Williamsburg in Virginia. And his mom called the Virginians Yankees. And that to me is so back east. That is a back east story. And you have to know the story of North-South conflict in the United States to understand why that's funny. But you also have to understand a Texan perspective. I don't think you can have that without back east. So I don't think the South is erased, but it plays a different role.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question here from Robert Mott asking if you could share your thoughts on how the concept of back east flattens the reality of the hyperlocal. I think that's hyperlocal. Yeah.
Hyperlocalism in states like Maine. He continues below that. Yeah.
Oh, there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it back east flattens hyperlocalism in places like Maine and Vermont, just like out west flattens hyperlocalism in places like New Mexico and Montana.
Mm-hmm.
So it's exactly the same dynamic, and that's something I wanted people to be aware of, is that, you know, when newcomers or tourists come to Western places, they often expect us all to be the same, or that, you know, they expect us to conform to the stories that they have about West, and hyperlocalism blows that out of the water, and the same is true for back east.
It also serves to amplify authors from those regions in some way. There's an irony in that, the silencing of like the generalizations made about a region also amplify kind of the ability to sell stories about it in some weird way. Do you know what I mean? In the publishing world, it both harms and abets the author. I'm sure you saw that in your research. Is there anything more you would say on that topic?
Well, I think the classic story is when the New York Times got Wallace Stegner's name wrong, and in the same instant called him the Dean of Western Writers. You know, so it's pretty major acclaim, and yet they didn't get his name right. You know, when Cormac McCarthy died, the New York Times said El Paso was in New Mexico. So I mean, they printed a correction.
Wow.
They're a good paper. They print corrections. So, but come on, you know, Cormac McCarthy, you know, Wallace Stegner. So yeah, so I think that's, you know, yes, Wallace Stegner got, you know, I'm sure he sold more books and got published in more places because he was the Dean of Western Writers, but he was also, you know, kind of considered provincial because he was a Western writer. And Deborah, you would know much better than I how a writer gets out of that particular paradox.
Mhm.
Well, thank you. I think we've answered people's questions, and I think we should maybe call it a day, unless either of you have any other last closing thoughts.
I was wondering, Paul, if I could explain to Deborah why I was so nervous when I interviewed her for the book.
Oh, please.
Oh, that's so funny. I didn't perceive
Um,
that you
All
were
of us can.
nervous. Yes. I would
so
love to
this
hear that.
this requires knowledge of Native American literature as well as 1960s rock music. So my husband is also an academic, and he wrote a book called "Tear Down These Walls," which is about 1960s rock music. And there's a chapter about the Rolling Stones in it, and people would regularly ask him, "Did you get to interview Mick Jagger?" And he was like, "No, no, like ethnomusicologists are really important, but I didn't get to interview Mick Jagger." But he would say, "I did get to interview Wayne Kramer of the MC5." And as I was doing this research, I was like, well, I could never interview Louise Erdrich. Like she's a superstar. And then Deborah Taffa, the Wayne Kramer of Native American literature, said that
That's so
she would
sweet.
agree to an interview. And so I walked into that interview thinking, this is my Wayne Kramer interview. I've got to do a good job.
Oh, you're so sweet. Thank you. I was nervous as well because, having left the Southwest and then finally finding a way to get back here and to be in Santa Fe, um, I think I have a little bit of a woundedness when it comes to my own children and the fact that they went to college back east. Three of them went to Yale, and I did not lead them in that direction. Kind of like with your cousins, the Gassans, it was an opportunity that kind of arose in their lives and they picked it up and they went. And I'm hyper conscious of the way it changes us to become code switching and capable of being in multiple regions. And there's a certain woundedness for indigenous people in having left their homeland and created these sort of boundaries, because for us sometimes it's hard to come back home. And so
Yeah.
when I heard the title of the book and the topic of the interview, it really threw me into a lot of thinking, as did reading the book. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today. And I especially appreciated that third section of the book where I saw a commonality in thought amongst Native authors who have all grappled with this in one way or the other. And in some ways, it's been very healing for me. So thank you so much, Flannery.
Thank you, Deborah. That's high praise indeed. Thank you.
Thank you both, and thank you both for participating in this wonderful event.